What's up, film fans? Some of you might have had this experience. Every once in a while you watch a film and something changes. Something about the way you watch cinema changes. It might be the way you understand special effects, character, narrative, the storytelling process. Something happens with that film, and going forward, you watch films differently. I hope that's happened to you. It happened to me in 2009 when I saw the film Wendy and Lucy, the subject of this week's episode of What Makes This Film Great. Hey everybody, this is Movie Talk with Aaron Hunter. I'm Aaron Hunter, and before we get into Wendy and Lucy, I just wanted to say that I have hit 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, which is not a lot in the grand scheme of YouTube life and YouTubers' sort of accumulation of followers. 1,000 is a pretty paltry number. But I think for a channel that does extended deep dives into films, mostly as a talking head, getting a little bit noodly about things, well, 1,000's pretty significant to me. So this Friday, if you're watching this soon after it posts, on the 18th of March, 2022, I'm gonna host a live stream to celebrate 1,000 subscribers. That's to celebrate you. The plan right now, and I'll post information about it in a day or two, is to run the live stream at 5 p.m. Irish time, which is where I am, which right now I believe, I have to check into this, but I believe that's gonna be at 1 p.m. on the East Coast of the US, because you guys have done daylight savings, you've sprung forward, and we haven't yet. We'll do it after that. So there's only a 4-hour difference right now. Let me clarify that, but I think it's gonna be 5 p.m. in Ireland, 1 p.m. US East Coast. I'll talk about the last year and a half. I'll talk about updates on my own work and research, and I'm gonna be giving away some books. So I've got just a few copies of my 3 books, one of each, and I'm gonna give some of those away. So yeah, tune in on Friday. More information in the community comments coming soon. As we continue this kind of triptych of episodes about director Kelly Reichardt, we'll consider the 2008 film Wendy and Lucy. It came out in late 2008, I think in December. It had shown at festivals earlier in the year, but in terms of its release to the general public, I didn't see it till 2009. I'd been reading about it in the AV Club. I think Scott Tobias wrote about it. They were proponents of Kelly Reichardt's films. I knew about her. I hadn't actually seen Old Joy at that point, and I was in the midst of my PhD, and I was looking around for different films to watch. I was well versed, if you've watched this channel, you know, in American indie cinema, but I had been sort of deep diving into my PhD topic, watching a lot of 70s Hollywood films, and kind of had lost touch for the last few years, and I wanted to sort of get back into that scene, and Tobias and others at the AV Club had a lot of really good things to say about Reichardt. So I tracked down Wendy and Lucy. I'd heard about the story. I watched it, and it really did make me rethink how cinema could work. I was a novice at that point with what might be called slow cinema, and I talked about this a little bit in the Old Joy discussion, so I won't go into it too much, but the idea that film can be about seemingly small events, that film can be about seemingly almost nothing, but the way that it's shot, edited, performed, those seemingly small events can accrue a dramatic heft that creates real kind of emotional power. And I'd heard of this. I was familiar with some filmmakers that I would become really invested in over the next few years. But Wendy and Lucy was the first film that sort of shifted something in me as I was watching, and mesmerized by this film in which very little happens Michelle Williams walks around a small town a lot, or I'm not sure if it's a small town or if it's like on the edge of Portland, Oregon. It's in Oregon, but she does a lot of walking. Not much happens. And yet, by the end of the film, I was shattered. I was just emotionally devastated. And I watched it again soon after. And then I began incorporating it into my teaching. And I started to track down Kelly Reichardt films where I could find them. And have tried to watch them all as they've come out. And I'm like her #1 fan. I'm not. But I love her films and love to promote them. And it all happened in this sort of tiny little apartment where I lived in Belfast while I was doing my PhD. And I put on Wendy and Lucy, not expecting much, and just had my sort of innards twisted and reformulated. So let's talk about it. As I mentioned, the film was directed by Kelly Reichardt. It was co-written by Reichardt and John Raymond, who had worked with her on Old Joy and continues to work with her. It's got cinematography by Sam Levy, who's kind of kept a foot in the popular indie world. He's worked with Noah Baumbach and Greta Gerwig, and so he shot, for example, Frances Ha and Lady Bird and other films as well. And it's mainly a one-hander. Can we call a film a one-hander? It's really a wonderful Michelle Williams vehicle. And I was aware of Michelle Williams as a great performer outside of her reputation as one of the stars of Dawson's Creek. I think when I was watching this film, when this film came out, that sort of reputation still was clinging to her as this kind of teen star, part of that troupe of Dawson's Creek performers. But she had already made, like almost 10 years earlier, Dick with Kirsten Dunst, which is a hilarious satire if you haven't seen it. And of course, she had just done a year or two earlier, I think, Brokeback Mountain. And so she was carving out a niche for herself as, I mean, what she would become, I think, is one of the preeminent actors of her generation in America. And Wendy and Lucy was the first time I recognized that. I mean, I'd seen her before, like I said, in Brokeback Mountain. She's kind of a supporting cast there. And she just carries Wendy and Lucy with so much sort of quiet determination, but also the way she lets her moments of fear, her moments of indecision come out. It's a very measured, restrained performance with moments of really clear emotional distress. And it's wonderful the way Williams tunes into the rhythm of Reichardt's filmmaking, and it's no surprise that Williams has continued to work with her, not in all of her films, but in many of her films since Wendy and Lucy, because they seem to have this sort of rhythmic tonal connection. It co-stars Will Patton, who plays a gruff, if somewhat sympathetic mechanic, and Walter Dalton, who is a security guard whose role is very important in the film. He seems to have one of those on the verge of retirement jobs. He's an older fella who is probably the sort of co-star of the film, aside from Lucy, the dog, who was also in Old Joy. Like Old Joy, it's an incredibly simple story on its surface. Wendy is on a road trip, but it's a road trip that seems to be driven by desperation. She's driving through Oregon from Indiana on her way to Alaska. So it's quite a trip, and she's looking for work. We don't know a lot about why. And when this film came out in late 2008, it hit right as the financial crisis was sort of, kneecapping the global economic system. And it was sort of received as an indictment of that system, although I think, and you can see a little bit of this in Old Joy with Kurt's character, I think Reichardt's concerns about economic precarity predate the crash of 2008. But it sort of came out at the right time. A lot like Winter's Bone did a couple years later, but it was sort of talked about in that same sort of tone as an indictment of the economic system. Anyhow, all we know is that Wendy is destitute. We see her notebook where she keeps a running balance of her cash, which is around $500, and that's what she needs to get from Oregon to Alaska, where she hopes to get work in the fishing industry. And she's traveling with Lucy, her traveling companion, her faithful dog. And some seemingly minor, depending on your situation in life, events occur in this town that disrupt the entirety of Wendy's plan. And that's what the movie's about. It takes place over approximately 2 days, depending on how you measure it. And in those 2 days, Wendy's plan falls apart. And we watch that plan fall apart in slow motion as her kind of dream of Alaska crumbles around her. Not completely. There's a ray of hope at the end, a slim ray of hope, but it's an open ending, so we don't know, just like we don't know a lot about Wendy's past, we don't know about Wendy's future. All we see is this moment of crisis where these incidental events happen and it sends everything spinning for her. So let's take a look at how the film sets this up, what those incidents are, and how the Wendy's reaction and the film's reaction to those events create this kind of emotionally dense ending or climax. And I should say, going into it, if you haven't seen the film, I am going to spoil the ending. It's not a big twisty-turny spoiler. It's very simple. It's probably predictable while you're watching the film, but if you want to watch it before you watch the rest of this video, go ahead and do so. It's only about 80 minutes long, and it's a fantastic film. You won't regret it. Come back and, start this from here, and let's get into it. The film opens with a series of shots of train yards, and the sound design, again, is fantastic in this film. Eric Hill does the location sound. Here, you just get this sort of chug, clang, click of trains coming into and going out of the station. For me, this is opening with an obvious and immediate metaphor. It's also a framing device, which we'll come to, but it's an obvious and immediate metaphor that has deep roots in American cinema, which is the train as a locus for flight. The train as a vehicle for destitute travelers. If you want to see a fantastic film, if I can make a quick side note, there was a documentary that came out, I think PBS put it out in the late 90s, called Riding the Rails. I recommend this to everybody. PBS used to broadcast it for free on their website. I don't know if they still do. It's a documentary film, and it was so well received that they actually did a cinematic release of it. And it's about teenagers in the Great Depression who were forced to leave home. Their parents couldn't afford to feed them, and they were like, "You're teenagers, you gotta go." And they rode the rails. And the documentary has a lot of information about the economic situation of families and teenagers in the 1930s. But what's wonderful about it is that it interviews about 7 or 8 people who, they're now elderly at that time, probably most of them have since passed away, who were forced to flee home in the 30s and ride the rails. And they're stories of the freedom of it, but also the danger, the precarity. They could be physically assaulted or murdered even. They could be arrested. They could go hungry. They could be sexually assaulted. All kinds of dangers around every corner. They could be beaten by the police. All of these dangers lurked around every corner. And maybe it's because I've watched that film so many times. When I see trains on screen, it makes me think of that. It also makes me think about the great 70s Hal Ashby film, Bound for Glory, which has so much train travel, and you get the Woody Guthrie, played by David Carradine, hopping trains and scenes of train rails and so on. But you can go to all kinds of films in American history and hopping the train, riding the rails, and the dangers of riding the rails is it's kind of a metaphor of the price of freedom in American cinema. And so to open like this, I think is a pointed tapping into that metaphor. Now, Wendy, very importantly, is not riding the rails. She's driving her car. It's an old beat up Accord, and that's going to play a very important role in the film. But we open with the trains, and then we cut to the first of many long scenes of Wendy walking. And in this case, she's walking with Lucy, and she's playing fetch with the dog. And then as the sort of opening titles come to an end and we get the title of the film, in a foreshadowing of what's to come, Lucy goes missing. And it's actually only kind of momentarily, but the way it resolves is very important. So Lucy goes missing, we get the opening title, we get Wendy calling out, "Lou, Lou," and then we cut to this moment.
Great dog. What's her name?
Lucy.
You're a sweetheart, Lucy. What is she?
I don't know, really a mix. Hunting dog and retriever.
Where's the closest store around here?
I don't know. We're not from around here. I'm just kind of passing through.
Where to?
So you have this camp of people who are clearly itinerant, and they're on the move, and they're around the fire. They know each other. Some of them seem to know each other better than others. In a lot of ways, this reminds me of the abandoned, littered campsite that Mark and Kurt find their first night camping in Old Joy. But there's this sense, as there is in Old Joy, of a threat. And here it feels like there's a possibility that they're not going to return the dog. They do, but having it set at night around the fire, we don't get to see all the faces. There's a lot of them, and there's this young woman who's kind of taken possession of the dog. There's this immediate threat, and the film opens this way on purpose because for Wendy, just like those kids riding the rails in the 30s, around every corner lurks the possibility of a threat. And that's an important tone to set in this film. And Old Joy had that in the sense that what's going to happen when they're in the woods? Are they getting lost in the woods? But it was always alleviated by the sense that you had these two guys who were friends, who knew each other for a long time, who could talk about their pasts. Here, Wendy's alone, and when she's not with other people, the only person she has to talk to is Lucy. And so that comfort rarely comes in the film. So even though not a lot happens, the film manages to sustain this tone of, if not danger, difficulty throughout the film. That tension is there, and that tension is what compels you to wonder, like, is she going to find her dog? Is she going to get her car fixed? Is she going to get out of this situation? Which is really just a young woman pulling into a town, hopefully stocking up on some supplies and then moving on. But because we spend so much time with her, because we get to know her precarity right away, and because of the way it's shot and acted, all of these seemingly mundane, potentially mundane situations are fraught with danger throughout the film. And that is part of what makes it compelling viewing. Then we get into the actual setup of the film's situation and Wendy's condition. She spends the night sleeping in her car in a Walgreens parking lot, and she's awoken the next morning by the security guard who I mentioned earlier, who tells her, you can't park here, you can't sleep here, you can't stay here. She's like, fine, fine, fine. She's all sort of discombobulated from being woken up, sleeping in her car, and then, of course, this happens.
My car won't start.
I can hear that. You can't park here, that's the rules.
Yeah. I got it, okay.
So one thing to consider here is, what does it mean when your car breaks down? This is one of those things that, depending on your financial or economic situation, can be a minor inconvenience, or the difference between, you know, whether you get a job or not, whether you can go to work or not, whether you lose your job or not, whether you can get to the hospital, get to your kids to school, and so on. And we all know that a car breaking down is never a good thing, because mechanics are gonna mechanic. You know, there's some wonderful mechanics out there. We have great mechanics right now. Love these guys. But mechanics are going to mechanic, and regardless of whether they're wonderful or, you know, sort of scammers, getting a car fixed, especially when it won't start, costs money. We've already seen, as I mentioned, her notebook and her budget, $500. I mean, $500 can go like that when we're talking about a car, right? And so now she has to deal with getting her car fixed. There's a garage right across the street, great. The garage is closed. And so now Wendy has two journeys. One, the journey to Alaska, which is the journey she's on. Two, the journey to get her car fixed. But she has to wait. So one of the things that keeps this tension alive in the film is these constant delays. And we'll see those over and over. She wants to get her car fixed. The garage is closed. She has to wait. So there's this tension of what's going to happen next, but then this enforced waiting period where the tension remains ratcheted. So while she's waiting, she decides to feed Lucy, and she realizes she's out of food. And then we get the next situation. And this scene is one of my kind of favorite scenes in recent film, in the last 15 or 20 years. She goes to the shop. She realizes she needs food. She doesn't have that much money. She's gonna have to pay for the car. So she risks shoplifting. And the film doesn't say if she's done it before, but it gives the impression that she's done it before. And let's just watch how this happens at the supermarket.
Ow!
Ma'am,
Ow! Let go of me.
I think you're forgetting something.
Let go of me.
I think you have something.
Let go of me.
All right, I'm gonna have to ask you to step inside the store, okay?
She gets caught. She gets busted. She gets taken to that back room. If you've ever been done for shoplifting, no comment. You might be familiar with that back room. And it's another really very sort of uncomfortable scene. Let's just take a look at the interrogation.
Sit here, please.
What's going on, Andy?
This customer neglected to pay for a few items. I watched the whole thing. I saw her since she came in the store.
No. I'm sorry, that isn't true.
Okay, well, what are we talking about here?
Excuse me?
Sir, I wasn't done shopping yet. I walked out of the door by accident without paying for those cans because I was going to check on my dog. My dog was
Mr.
tied up in front of the store.
Mr. Hunt, it was obvious what was going on here.
Sir, your employee has the wrong ID.
The rules apply to everyone equally. If a person can't afford dog food, they shouldn't have a dog.
Andy,
Sir, I just made a mistake is all. I'm very sorry. This isn't gonna happen again. I'm really very
Food
sorry.
is not the issue. It's about setting an example, right?
I'm not from around here, sir. I can't be an example.
we have a policy, ma'am.
Hi, this is Andy Mooney from Jack's on Lombard.
Andy there is played by John Robinson. Some of you might recognize him from another great earlier indie film, Elephant, the Gus Van Sant movie. What a prick, right? What a prick. Rules are rules, you know. Oh, if you can't feed your dog, you shouldn't have a dog. This lack of empathy is intense. Some of you might be going like, well, it's true. But there's a situation she's in and she needs help, not a reprimand. So she gets arrested. She gets taken to the police station. And again, there are delays. The most frustrating one is that she gets fingerprinted while she's getting booked. And then she finds out that the guy who did the fingerprinting did it wrong.
This machine's gonna kill me. We gotta do this again.
More delay. And of course, what happens is she gets back to the supermarket finally several hours later. Almost the whole day passes. We get these shots of the clock as hours are passing. And on top of all that, there's a $50 fine to get herself out of jail. And she gets back to the supermarket and Lucy's gone. Get to Alaska. Get the car fixed. Find her dog. And now the film has become Wendy and Lucy. It's become something different. It's become this pressing need to find her only companion. And this is what the film's gonna come to be about. And the title's very interesting, Wendy and Lucy, because Lucy goes missing at the end of the first act. And you know, we're about 25 minutes into the film, and then Lucy's gone for the rest of the film until the end. And that Wendy and Lucy is kind of, there's a sadness to that title, I think, because it's really Wendy without Lucy. In a lot of ways, the film is Wendy preparing to be without Lucy. And so the title's misleading in a lot of ways, but intentionally so, I think. And so the rest of the film is going to become about her efforts to find her dog and get her car repaired. And there's not really a lot to say about what happens. The security guard becomes very friendly to her in a completely sort of innocent and kind way. He lets her use his phone. He's got an old flip phone. He says, I've got plenty of minutes. And he tells her where the pound is. Of course, it's too late. The pound's closed. So there's another delay. Then the film is just this sort of two-pronged effort of Wendy to find her dog and to get her car fixed. And neither one of these things go particularly well. And Wendy's really on her own. And she is, as I said, without Lucy. And it's just her alone. And this is where we get scene after scene of kind of Michelle Williams walking to places. She does take the bus on occasion, but every time she takes the bus, she knows she's spending money. She takes a taxi, she's spending money. Every time she does one of these things, it's a dent into that small nest egg that she needs to get her to Alaska. So she's kind of, you wouldn't want to say pissing it away because it's necessary, but she's aware, you know, we see her adding it up. She's aware that she's like a leaky boat that's sinking. That night she sleeps in her car again, and we get a sense here of, again, the precarity or danger of this situation as these teenage boys walk by.
Madison's got some chunky cheerleaders. Dude, fuck this lady. Your mom's always tired.
Now, they don't do anything, but you see how vulnerable she is. She's on the street now because she can't park in the parking lot. But these boys could have screwed with her. They didn't, but you get that sense that it's possible. And so the film is constantly reminding you that these possibilities lurk around every corner, and that's going to build to something bigger on her second night. She wakes up, and day 2 is concerned with 2 things: getting to the pound and getting to the garage. And both of those prove, in a way, fruitless. So she gets out to the pound, and there's again this lovingly shot, tracking shot or dolly shot, where she's told, go back there and look. I don't know if your dog's here, but go back there and look. And this is what we see. And it's sort of incredibly done to, again, create a sense of tension, because that slow dolly creates this anticipation that in each one of these little cubicles, we're going to come across Lucy. And each time we don't, there's a little letdown, and then another bit of hope, and then a little letdown, and then another bit of hope. And we cut to Wendy, and then we cut back, and there's no Lucy there, right? So there's another delay, a delay of finding the dog. A different kind of delay occurs when she goes to the garage. They're finally open. She goes in, and you get this frustrating moment that I think we've all had before.
Voltmeter reads less than 14 volts. You know, it should read 14. Okay? If it reads less than 12, you might have a problem. Okay. Tell you what. You turn on the heater. You turn on the defogger. You turn on the radio, and you rev up the motor. You turn it on everything that draws power, and then you turn on the motor. You rev up the motor. And if the voltmeter reads lower than 14 volts, your alternator is probably no good, okay? Well, good luck. What's up?
So Wendy just has to wait for this guy to talk on the phone and having this conversation that's frustrating to him as well, clearly. And then she presents her case to the mechanic.
I think my serpentine belt is cracked.
Oh, yeah. 17.
Yeah. A guy in Salt Lake City said that he thought it was cracked and that it would run about $150 for a new one.
You were driving with the air conditioning on? The engine jerked, steam came out, that kind of thing?
No, it just won't start. It just makes this terrible sound.
Yeah. Oh, man. Okay. Yeah. I'll see you later. What kind of car are we talking about?
It's an Accord, 1988. It's right over there.
Well, easy enough to replace serpentine belt. I don't know why the ignition won't fire, though. Who knows? Could be the timing belt.
How much is a new serpentine belt?
Oh, $100, 125. Depends on if we have to order a new one. I'll have to check stock. And be 50 for labor. That's the best you'll find, I promise that.
Okay, and what about a timing belt? How much is that?
It could be a little bit more, but I won't know until I have a look.
Okay.
And we're going to have to tow it over, I guess. That adds another 50.
But it's just right there.
Well, it's always 50, but there's no mileage here, so it's just 50.
Oh, you gotta pay to have it towed from there to there. We don't charge by the mileage, it's just the job. He does give her a little break at the end, but there's that sense you can feel that money is slipping away. And so now she's gone through the second day. The first day she gets arrested for shoplifting, and now we're in the second day, and she's found out that her dog's not in the pound, and she's found out that there's a pretty good chance that getting her car fixed is gonna cost more than she thought. And this is what I think, for me, when I watch Kelly Reichardt's films, and some of them kind of double down on this more than others, what makes them so fascinating is that she takes moments that in a lot of films would be 2 or 3 scenes, maybe the length of an act or half of an act, depending on where in the film it comes. And she turns that into the whole film. And she takes these moments that could be considered minor, inconvenient, frustrating, and explores the depths of what that means in a life. And it occurs in a life when the protagonist or the protagonists are searching for something. They're looking for something. They're looking for a way out, a way to something new, a way to change their life. So you get in Old Joy, Mark, this sort of Gen X, becoming a yuppie, about to become a father, losing his youth, looking for some meaning, and he opens the film meditating. And Kurt, his old friend, maybe his old party buddy, who seems lost in life, looking for human connection. And they're both trying to find a new way to experience their 30s. Here you get Wendy. We don't know why she's broke. She calls home at one point and her sister's like, I can't help you. I don't have any money. The family's broke, it seems like. But we don't know why. She's trying to start something new. She's going to Alaska. She's taking this huge risk. And she's trying to, find a way to establish a life. She's not even maybe looking for meaning at this point. She's looking for stability, after which perhaps she can concentrate on meaning. And when we get to Meek's Cutoff, which I'll talk about in the next episode, there's a very, very clear and obvious search for a new life as we get this film about pioneers going from the Midwest of the United States, traveling west to trying to, establish a new life on the West Coast. And something happens in the midst of this quest or this journey, and it's often something minor or seemingly minor that might seem minor to you, who's sort of in a slightly more or obviously more secure living situation. Your car breaks down, you lose your dog. You walk around town and you see missing dog signs all the time. And it's sad. I have a little puppy. If he went missing, I'd be devastated. My son would cry his eyes out. They often come back a day or two later. But what Reichardt's interested in here, what the film's interested in here, is what's a situation in which the loss of a dog, the breakdown of a car, isn't sad, isn't heartbreaking, but is ruinous, is financially, emotionally devastating in such a way that it might completely upend your life. And that's where we spend time, in those moments of crisis. And that's where this film spends time, in these moments of crisis. And all that Wendy can do is keep going, which is why we see her walking all the time. She's got to go to the next place. She's got to get to the next stage. She can't sit still. There are very few moments in the film, and there are some where she just kind of sits. She sits and has a chat with the security guard. And when she moves off to places where she might be alone, that's where the danger comes in. And one of the film's most kind of devastating, thrilling, and I mean that in the scary way, scenes, she decides on the second night she can't sleep in her car because it's in the garage. So she finds a place in the woods to sleep, and she thinks she's hidden herself really well, and then this happens.
Don't look at me.
She gets away, seemingly unscathed. We don't know the film, there might be an ellipsis there where we don't see what happens, but seemingly unscathed physically. But emotionally and psychologically, this moment is kind of a breaking point for her, and she runs back into town and she runs into this service station bathroom that she's been using, and she breaks down. And this is where she's not just breaking down over this potential assault that she just barely got away from. She's breaking down over the loss of her car. She's breaking down over the loss of her dog. She's breaking down over the loss of this sliver of a dream that she has that's slowly slipping out of her grasp. After this, she stays up for the rest of the night, which is understandable. And then the film moves into its third act, and quickly things begin to resolve somewhat. And this is where, if you don't want ending spoilers, turn this off now, because here they come. And it happens fast. The first thing is that as she sits in this Walgreens parking lot looking for the security guard, she wants to decompress. She wants to just kind of let these emotions go somewhere, and he's not there. And then he shows up and he brings good news and a gift. And the good news comes in the way of a phone call he received after she left to go try to sleep sleep rough. And she calls the pound and she gets an address. Lucy's been found. And then the gift comes like this.
Well, I hope it all works out. I know it will. I want you to take this. Don't argue. Just don't argue. Don't let Holly see it. Just, if you ever come by here again, you just stop by and say hi, huh?
Thank you. I will.
Okay. Bye-bye.
It's a lovely, delicate, touching, heartbreaking scene, because she's just received this news that Lucy is at a house somewhere in town, and then he gives her this gift, and you're like, oh, that's so nice of him. He's been so nice, such a good presence in the film. And then she looks at the money. It's $6 or $7, and it's devastating, because the gift is great. It's wonderful. You can tell it's a sacrifice for him, but it's almost nothing. It probably doesn't even pay the cab fare when she goes to the house where Lucy is near the end of the film. But before she can do that, we get another resolution. She goes to the garage to find out what the situation with her car is, and she discovers this.
You've got milky oil.
I didn't ask you to check the oil.
I'm just telling you. You snapped a piston rod. Actually, you blew the head gasket first. Water got into the cylinder probably when you cooled down. And the rod can't compress the fluid then. And there you go. You end up with what they call hydrolock. And if you want the car to drive again, you have to rebuild the whole engine. And honestly, I don't think that's what you want to do. It end up costing more than the car is worth.
This is that moment. This is like the time right before Christmas when my wife and I were struggling and we didn't have very much money. We found a little thing wrong with our car. We brought it into the garage, and he's like, yeah, that thing's wrong, but also your brakes are about to go, and that's gonna cost 600 pounds. Oh. Our lives were not as precarious as Wendy's, but that, Christmas went out the door that year. And, you think about Wendy's situation is even worse here, because that's it, her car's gone. There's no other option. The scene doesn't resolve it. It doesn't show us her choice, but there's no option. She doesn't have $2,000. That's it, the car's gone. What's she gonna do? At least she can go see Lucy, and this is where the rip your heart out moment comes. She goes to the house. She watches the owner leave, and she goes out back, and she sees Lucy.
Hey, Lou. Hey. Hey, Lou. Did you miss me? Huh? Do you miss me? Huh? You miss me? Huh? Come here, Luce. Come here. Do you miss me? I'm sorry. Come here.
I'm not going to show you the final moments of that scene because they are special and they are devastating, and it's really worth watching for the weight of it. But she decides, as I think you could tell from what I have shown, that Lucy's better off and she's going to leave Lucy behind. And then we get a bookend with the opening in the train yard, that foreshadowing that I mentioned that led to this moment, perhaps the only moment that the film could end on. This is a wonderful film, and it's a film that taught me to think about patience in cinema, that also taught me to think more deeply about nuance in cinema, that taught me to think about a different kind of performance. I think oftentimes when we watch films when we're maybe younger or when we're first learning about what makes films work, you know, we get beyond the sort of kiddie or young teenage of like, oh, that was cool, and we notice the actors, for example, who we start to pay attention to, and they're often, you know, this sort of thing. And that's great, but there's also this restrained, controlled, nuanced performance by someone like Michelle Williams and Wendy and Lucy that just carries with it so much. And if you've watched my channel, you know how much I care about the way narrative and cinematography and editing and performance all work together. And here, this is what we're seeing. We're seeing this strong woman of resolve have her resolve chipped away, to have everything that's important to her, which is not very much, stripped away from her. And it's heartbreaking, and yet there is something of a hope at the end. There is this sense that she's going to keep going. It might not end well, we don't know. But she hasn't been broken yet. At least there's that. Thanks for watching, everybody. This is one of my favorite films, and you know, let me know what you think about Wendy and Lucy in the comments. It's a small film and it's a slow film, but for me, it's a vastly important, incredible film. So I hope you've enjoyed me discussing it. If you have, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe, share this video with your friends, and don't forget the live stream coming up on the 18th of March, 2022. My name is Aaron Hunter. Keep watching movies.